the next planet is our planet, Earth. And we have one moon. It's quite large compared to the size of the Earth. And so some call it a binary planet system because our moon is the size of Mercury. So it's large enough to be a planet. It just happens to be orbiting our Earth, and so we consider it a moon. When you look at the moon, you can see very clearly there are dark patches and light patches. The dark patches are called Maria, which is Latin for seas. The light patches are called Terra, which is Latin for land. So you can see by the terms that when they first looked at the moon, they thought these were oceans. At least Galileo did. These were oceans and these were continents. Makes sense, but it's not the case. The dark areas are not oceans of water. At one time, they were oceans of molten rock. That molten rock is now crystallized into flat plains. This is the crescent moon. You'll notice sometimes during a crescent moon, you can see the rest of it. It's light. Have you ever seen that? You see the rest of the moon? You know why it's light? What's lighting this side of the moon? In other words, when you look up the moon and you can see the dark side of the moon, this kind of has that faint glow to it. What is this causing the dark side of the moon to glow? From the Earth. That's light that's hitting the Earth. Have you ever gone out at full moon at night and you can see stuff? You can see shadows at night. The reason you're seeing shadows is because sunlight is hitting the moon, right, and bouncing toward the Earth. It's shining on the dark side of the Earth. So this is light that's hitting the Earth and shining on the dark side of the moon. That's causing that faint glow that you see. So I guess it's, what's it called, moonlight? This would be not moonlight, but earth light. Earth light on the dark side of the moon, rather than moonlight. So anyway, there's an image of the moon's surface. Terra Maria. Here's that diagram of astrophysicists believe, astronomers believe that the early moon was completely molten like the planets. Then the outer crust began to harden, crystallize, and then there were large impacts that formed the Terra. And then at some point in the history of the solar system, there were very large impacts, asteroids, that went through the Terra and punctured the molten interior. And that molten interior, the material flowed out on the surface like large seas, molten rock. As you can see here, you see the puncture that's taken place. It's like it's bleeding over the surface. But that blood is molten rock, and it forms these big seas of molten rock, and then it hardened. And we know it's fairly recent because it's not as cratered as the Terra. So it's a more recent phenomenon. At least that's the scenario. We see one side of the moon all the time. And the reason is because that side of the moon always faces the Earth. It's been captured by the Earth's gravitational field. So as the moon rotates, it's rotating at the exact same speed that it's orbiting the Earth. So that means there's a side of the moon that we had never seen before. Not the dark side of the moon, but the far side of the moon. And so people thought, well, that's where the UFO bases are. That's where the UFOs have all their spacecraft on the far side of the moon because we can't see it. It's clever. Makes sense to me. And so we set up the first orbiter around the moon. As it began to orbit the moon with men inside, they looked down for the first time on a part of the moon that had never been seen before. And there weren't any UFOs. But that's because they're all underground. They're not going to put their air bases on the surface where you can see them. It doesn't make any sense. Since the moon has no atmosphere, whenever meteors hit the surface, they hit the surface with full impact. And since there's no plants on the moon to hide the impacts, you can see cratering on the moon better than you can any place else because it's close to the Earth. So you see some of the large impact craters. On the far side of the moon, what was interesting, there was very, very little Maria on the far side of the moon. It was mostly Terra. However, they did find a very large impact crater. As you can see here, this is the place of impact. You see these concentric circles? Those are waves. When you put rock under intense pressure, it behaves like a plastic material, like taffy. It will actually deform. And as that shock wave is moving through the surface, the rock actually forms large waves. But when it passes through, those waves are frozen back into rock. And so it's like throwing a pebble into the pond. It creates concentric circles. But instead of those circles continuing to flow outward, because a liquid always stays a liquid, it freezes a certain point once the shock wave is through, and it becomes a concentric rings of mountains, which you see here. This is a photograph taken of Earthrise from the moon by the lander. That's the orbiter. As you can see the Earth in the distance. And men have walked on the moon. I can remember it. That's how old I am. I was 9 years old when men first walked on the moon. Earthrise. Doesn't that make you feel far from home?